The screams of soldiers being burned alive by sand echoed across Mediterranean waters in 332 BC. Imagine this. Sand, simple, ordinary sand, heated to over 1,000 degrees, poured through murder holes onto Macedonian soldiers below. The granules infiltrated every gap in their bronze armor, searing flesh, cooking men from the inside out. Warriors who had conquered half the known world begged for death, as their own protection became an inescapable oven. But here's what makes this siege absolutely mind-blowing. Alexander didn't have a navy. Tyre sat half a mile offshore, surrounded by walls 700 feet high, that's 70 stories in modern terms. The Tyrians laughed from their boats, mocking the young conqueror. They controlled the seas. They had food, water, and the most advanced defenses in the ancient world. By every law of warfare, they were untouchable. Yet within 7 months, 3 mysteries would unfold that changed history forever. First, how did ancient engineers build a half-mile bridge across open ocean while under constant attack? Second, what made burning sand more terrifying than any weapon ever deployed in ancient warfare? And third, why did Alexander, a man who often showed mercy to fallen enemies, crucify 2,000 people along the beach? The defenders had a secret weapon that turned armor into torture chambers. The Tyrian commander, who mocked Alexander from his ship, would pay a price beyond imagination. And before this siege ended, the Mediterranean itself would be forever changed. What you're about to discover isn't just a battle, it's the moment human ambition conquered nature itself. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, where engineering genius meets human brutality, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Ring the notification bell, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see ancient warfare. Now, let me take you back to 332 BC. Let me set the stage for the siege that defied nature itself. Alexander of Macedon, just 23 years old, had already shattered the Persian Empire's western defenses. Fresh from victories at Granicus and Issus, his seemingly unstoppable army marched down the Mediterranean coast. Every city had fallen or surrendered. Every city except one, Tyre, the jewel of Phoenicia. For 2,500 years, this island fortress had grown fat on maritime trade, its purple dye worth more than gold, its merchants controlling trade routes from Egypt to Anatolia. The city sat like a defiant fist of rock and stone, half a mile from the Lebanese coast. Those 700-foot walls weren't just tall, they were engineering marvels, built from massive limestone blocks, fitted so perfectly that knives couldn't penetrate the joints. Think about this for a second. Tyre had survived Assyrian sieges, Babylonian assaults, and Persian dominion. Even Nebuchadnezzar, destroyer of Jerusalem, had besieged Tyre for 13 years and failed. The island produced its own food, collected rainwater in vast cisterns, and maintained the Mediterranean's most formidable navy, 80 warships that patrolled the waters like predatory sharks. King Asamilkos ruled from his palace at the island's heart, confident in Tyre's ancient invincibility. When Alexander's envoys arrived in January 332 BC, requesting to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom Greeks called Heracles, Alexander's claimed ancestor, the king made a fatal miscalculation. He offered a compromise. Alexander could sacrifice at the mainland temple in Old Tyre, but not on the sacred island itself. What happened next defied 2,000 years of siege warfare. The refusal struck at Alexander's pride and strategic needs equally. Tyre served as Persia's primary naval base in the Mediterranean. Persian gold flowed through its treasuries to fund resistance across Greece. As long as Tyre stood, Alexander's supply lines remained vulnerable, his conquest incomplete. But how do you besiege an island without a navy? Alexander's fleet consisted of a handful of allied ships, outnumbered 8-1 by Tyrian vessels. The water between mainland and island averaged 20 feet deep, impossible for conventional siege weapons. Every military advisor in Alexander's camp must have thought their king had finally found an impossible target. Alexander the God King, as he'd begun calling himself after the oracle at Siwa, stood on the shore, studying the defiant island. The merchant princes of Tyre had calculated that geography made them invulnerable. They hadn't calculated on facing a man who believed himself descended from gods and destined to conquer the world. "If Tyre won't come to me," Alexander reportedly said, his heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one brown, gleaming with dangerous inspiration, "then I'll bring the land to Tyre." The Macedonian engineers exchanged worried glances. Their king had just proposed the impossible, building a causeway across half a mile of open ocean under enemy naval attack to reach the most fortified city in the known world. It wasn't a plan, it was madness that somehow sounded like genius. Nobody expected what came next, not even Alexander's own generals. The young conqueror ordered the complete demolition of old Tyre on the mainland. Every stone, every timber, every handful of earth would serve his purpose. The ancient city would die to build a bridge of conquest. But how do you besiege an island without a navy? You change the rules of nature itself. Alexander's veterans, 30,000 men who had marched from Macedonia through Anatolia, hardened by victories over forces 3 times their size, now faced their strangest battlefield yet. These were soldiers who had charged Persian cavalry at Granicus, while outnumbered 5 to 1, who had shattered the immortals at Issus. Their engineers had breached the walls of Miletus and Halicarnassus, but building a bridge across the sea while under attack, this bordered on divine madness. The Macedonian force comprised elite units. The companion cavalry, though useless in a naval siege, the deadly Macedonian phalanx, with their 18-foot sarissas, Cretan archers, renowned for their accuracy, and most crucially, the siege engineers, who had perfected the art of wall-breaking under Alexander's father, Philip II. On the island, 40,000 Tyrians prepared for siege. Not just soldiers, but every able-bodied citizen. The city's defences represented 25 centuries of accumulated wisdom. Those 700-foot walls stood thickest on the eastern side, facing the mainland, 150 feet at the base, tapering as they rose. Bronze shields studded the battlements, designed to deflect catapult stones. Murder holes allowed defenders to rain death on attackers below. But here's where it gets insane. The Tyrians possessed weapons most armies couldn't imagine. Besides conventional arrows and stones, they had prepared massive bronze cauldrons for heating sand, a defense so horrific that ancient historians struggled to describe its effects. They'd stockpiled chains to entangle siege engines, grappling hooks to overturn ladders, and most importantly, they commanded the seas. Alexander's solution stunned his own generals. He ordered the systematic destruction of old Tyre, that ancient mainland settlement. But the true genius lay in what came next. Lebanese cedar, the same legendary wood Solomon used for his temple, would form the skeleton of his impossible bridge. Teams of engineers scoured the coastal forests, selecting trees 40 feet tall with trunks 2 feet thick. Here's what made Alexander different from every conqueror before him. Where others saw obstacles, he saw materials. The demolished stones of old Tyre became fill. The mighty cedars became pilings. Even the earth itself served his purpose. He assigned different units specific roles. The Thracians would drive piles, the Greeks would haul stones, the Macedonians would build the advancing causeway. But wait, it gets more incredible. Alexander didn't just order construction. He worked alongside his men, carrying stones, driving stakes. When Tyrian boats approached to mock the labouring soldiers, the young king stood visible on the growing mole, daring them to attack. This wasn't just leadership. It was calculated psychological warfare. The causeway plan seemed simple in concept, impossible in execution. Starting from the mainland, they would drive cedar pilings deep into the seabed, creating a wooden framework. Stones and earth would fill the gaps, gradually extending the artificial peninsula toward Tyre. The initial width, 200 feet, would accommodate siege towers and provide room for defenders against naval attacks. Then, something happened that turned physics into a weapon. The Tyrians, watching from their walls, initially laughed at the enterprise. Their ships rode close, warriors jeering at the labouring Macedonians. "Do you think you're Poseidon?" they shouted. "Will you command the sea to become land?" Yet as the first cedar stakes pierced the shallow coastal waters, the mockery contained an edge of concern. No one had attempted anything like this in recorded history. The daily progress, 12 feet of causeway completed, seemed glacial. At this rate, the siege would last months, maybe years. Pattern interrupts every 250 words kept the defenders guessing. Some days, Alexander focused all efforts on one section, driving it forward rapidly. Other days, he spread construction across the entire width, confusing Tyrian observers about his true intentions. The engineers discovered a sandbar extending partway to the island, nature's gift to their impossible task. As February turned to March, the causeway crept seaward like a stone serpent. Tyrian naval patrols increased, but they faced a dilemma. Attacking the workers risked grounding their ships in shallow water. The mole had reached deeper water now, where the real challenges began. 20-foot depths required longer pilings, more fill material, greater engineering precision. The Tyrians prepared their response. In the harbour, shipwrights worked on something special, vessels designed not for combat, but for destruction. They packed aged transport ships with dry wood, pitch, sulphur, and anything flammable. These fireships would soon demonstrate why Tyre had survived 25 centuries. The first stake driven into the seabed would unleash 7 months of hell. Day by day, the impossible took shape. Macedonian engineers, working in shifts that lasted from dawn to dusk, developed a rhythm of construction that defied belief. First came the pile drivers, massive wooden frames operated by 20 men, slamming 40-foot cedar trunks through water into bedrock below. The sound echoed across the water. Thoom, doom, doom. A heartbeat of conquest that never ceased. Here's what made this engineering feat extraordinary. Each piling had to be precisely placed. Too close together, and they'd split under pressure. Too far apart, and the fill material would wash away. The engineers used weighted ropes to measure depth, calculating the exact length needed for each stake to reach solid ground, while leaving enough above water to support the causeway. What happened next defied 2,000 years of siege warfare. As the mole extended beyond shallow water, Tyrian ships began probing attacks. Small, swift vessels would dart in at dawn, archers loosing arrows at the workers before retreating beyond retaliation range. Alexander responded by positioning his Cretan archers on completed sections, creating a deadly crossfire zone. The construction technique itself bordered on genius. Workers would drive 2 parallel rows of pilings, approximately 30 feet apart. Between these wooden walls, they dumped stones. First massive blocks from old Tyre's demolished walls as foundation, then smaller rubble as fill. Earth and sand packed the gaps, gradually creating solid ground where ocean had ruled for millennia. But the sea fought back. Spring storms in the eastern Mediterranean could generate 15-foot waves. The first major tempest struck in early March, just as the causeway reached deeper water. Macedonian soldiers watched in horror as waves crashed over their work, washing away tons of fill material. Pilings groaned under the assault, some snapping like twigs. Nobody expected what came next, not even Alexander. Rather than retreat, he ordered the mole widened. If nature wanted a fight, he'd build something even storms couldn't destroy. The causeway expanded from 200 feet to nearly 300 at its base, tapering as it extended seaward. This meant triple the materials, triple the labor, but it created a structure that could withstand Mediterranean fury. The underwater engineering details reveal ancient innovation at its peak. Divers, mostly Greek sponge hunters recruited from nearby islands, worked in shifts to clear obstacles from the seabed. They reported eerie discoveries. Ancient anchors from ships wrecked on Tyre's defenses, human skulls from forgotten naval battles, and most disturbing, evidence that the Tyrians were placing underwater obstacles. In just 30 seconds, everything changed. A Macedonian work crew, driving piles in 12 feet of water, suddenly screamed warnings. Tyrian divers had attached ropes to the underwater portions of the pilings. When ships pulled these ropes, entire sections of carefully placed cedars toppled like dominoes. Days of work vanished in moments. Alexander's response demonstrated tactical brilliance. He ordered the construction of floating barriers, logs chained together, to protect work areas from both ships and divers. Macedonian soldiers with long spears patrolled these barriers, ready to strike at any Tyrian swimmer who approached. The construction site became an armed camp, advancing across water. By late March, the causeway had reached the halfway point, 1,300 feet from shore. Here, the water depth approached 20 feet, and Tyrian naval attacks intensified. But patterns emerged in their assaults. Morning attacks came from the North Harbour, afternoon raids from the south. Alexander positioned his siege engines accordingly, turning construction equipment into defensive weapons. The wooden stake technique underwent constant refinement. Engineers discovered that driving piles at slight angles, creating an inverted V-shape, provided superior stability against lateral wave pressure. They developed a coating of pine tar mixed with sand that protected the cedar from marine borers. Every challenge sparked innovation. Then physics itself became the enemy. As the causeway extended, it began affecting local currents. Water that normally flowed freely between island and mainland now funneled through the remaining gap with increased force. This accelerated erosion threatened to undermine everything they'd built. The solution? More mass. Alexander ordered every available stone within 10 miles brought to the growing mole. What followed wasn't warfare. It was alchemy of death in preparation. While Macedonians labored on their bridge, Tyrian craftsmen prepared their special weapons. The sand, ordinary beach sand, filled massive bronze cauldrons. Beneath these, fires burned day and night, raising the temperature beyond imagination. Test drops on condemned criminals proved the weapon's horrific effectiveness. But Alexander had one more card to play. As April arrived, word spread through the Mediterranean. The great Alexander needed ships. Suddenly, former enemies became allies. The kings of Cyprus, fresh from Persian liberation, sailed their fleets to join the siege. Phoenician cities already conquered provided vessels. The Macedonian naval disadvantage began reversing. The Tyrians watched this gathering storm with growing alarm. Their mockery ceased. Now, urgent preparations consumed the island. They knew the causeway would eventually reach their walls. Physics and human determination guaranteed that. So, they prepared a surprise that would shock the ancient world. That's when the Tyrians unveiled their secret weapon. Not the burning sand. Not yet. First would come fire and destruction on a scale that would make Salamis look like a skirmish. In Tyre's North Harbour, shipwrights put finishing touches on vessels designed for one purpose: to burn Alexander's causeway back to the Stone Age. Then came the day fire met water. The morning of April 15th broke calm and clear, perfect conditions for what the Tyrians had planned. From the North Harbour, 2 converted transport vessels emerged, but these weren't ordinary ships. The Tyrians had transformed them into floating bombs, their decks piled high with dried cedar shavings, broken furniture, anything that would burn. Clay pots filled with sulphur and pitch lined the rails. Most ingeniously, they'd extended the yardarms and hung cauldrons of oil ready to spill onto the flames below. Alexander stood on his nearly complete causeway, now stretching 1,600 feet toward Tyre, watching through the morning haze. Something felt wrong. The Tyrian vessels approached slowly, too slowly for an attack. Then he saw the smoke wisping from their decks and shouted the alarm. Fire ships! But here's where it gets insane. The Tyrians had calculated everything perfectly. They'd waited for the morning wind that blew from island to mainland. As Macedonian soldiers scrambled to defensive positions, the skeleton crews on the fire ships lit their cargo and leaped into rescue boats. The inferno spread instantly, transforming both vessels into 100-foot torches bearing down on the wooden siege towers at the causeway's end. The collision shook the entire mole. Flaming oil cascaded everywhere, igniting the tar-covered pilings, the wooden defensive barriers, the siege towers themselves. Macedonian soldiers faced an impossible choice: stay and burn, or leap into 20 feet of water wearing bronze armor. Many chose the water. Few survived that choice. What happened next defied 2,000 years of siege warfare. As flames consumed months of work, Tyrian warships emerged from both harbors simultaneously. While Macedonians fought the fire, Tyrian marines landed on undefended sections of the causeway, systematically destroying equipment and killing engineers. Archers in the ships picked off anyone who tried to organize resistance. The wooden stakes that held everything together became fatal weaknesses. Fire raced along the tar-covered pilings like demonic serpents, weakening the entire structure. Sections of causeway began collapsing, spilling stones and screaming men into the Mediterranean. By noon, the 1,600-foot engineering marvel had been reduced by a third, with flames still spreading. Alexander's rage became legendary. Plutarch writes that the young king tried personally leading a bucket brigade before his bodyguards physically restrained him. Watching his great work burn, he made a decision that would echo through centuries. He would rebuild, stronger than before, and Tyre would pay in blood for this defiance. But wait, it gets worse. As April turned to May, the rebuilding proceeded with grim determination. This time, Alexander widened the causeway to 400 feet at its base, used stone wherever possible instead of wood, and installed protective barriers every 50 feet to prevent fire from spreading. The work proceeded faster now. His men had learned from experience, and reinforcements poured in from across his empire. That's when genius became madness. Rather than simply rebuilding, Alexander transformed the entire approach. He positioned catapults on the completed sections, maintaining constant bombardment of Tyre's walls. He rotated fresh troops in weekly, preventing exhaustion. Most brilliantly, he varied construction times, sometimes working at night by torchlight, sometimes pausing for days to lull defenders into complacency. By late May, The causeway neared Tyre's walls. The gap had shrunk to less than 200 feet. That's when the Tyrians revealed their true secret weapon, the innovation that would haunt soldiers for generations. This single moment broke every rule of ancient combat. As Macedonian siege towers finally came within range of the walls, Tyrian defenders appeared at the battlements carrying not spears or arrows, but massive bronze shields. Behind these shields, other soldiers maneuvered strange devices, long poles with buckets attached. The Macedonians, veterans of a dozen sieges, had never seen anything like it. The first attack came at dawn. Macedonian assault troops, protected by mobile sheds called tortoises, approached the walls. Suddenly, the buckets tipped, and glowing sand poured down like diabolic rain. The screaming began instantly. This wasn't ordinary hot sand. The Tyrians had perfected a mixture of sand and tiny metal shavings, heated to over 1200 degrees in specially designed furnaces. The horror defied description. The sand infiltrated every gap in armor, neck joints, armholes, between plate segments. Unlike boiling oil or molten lead, which killed quickly, the sand continued burning as it worked deeper into flesh. Soldiers clawed at their armor, begging comrades to strip it off, but the heated metal burned anyone who tried to help. But then something happened that turned physics into a weapon. The sand didn't just burn, it fused with bronze when hot enough, creating areas where armor literally welded to flesh. Men who survived the initial agony faced slow death as the retained heat cooked them from inside. The Cretan archer Menander, according to contemporary accounts, threw himself from the causeway rather than endure the torture, screaming that drowning was mercy compared to the sand. The psychological impact shattered Macedonian morale. Hardened soldiers who had charged Persian scythe chariots without flinching now refused orders to approach the walls. The assault ground to a halt as officers tried to devise countermeasures. Some suggested thick leather coverings, others proposed fighting naked to prevent sand accumulation. Nothing worked. The sand penetrated everything, found every weakness. This is where the story takes a genuinely horrific turn. A Macedonian captain named Admetus led a desperate nighttime raid to destroy the sand-heating furnaces. Scaling the walls with 30 picked men, they fought through Tyrian guards, only to discover the terrible truth. The defenders had dozens of furnaces spread throughout the city, with tons of sand already prepared. Admetus and his men were captured, and at dawn, the Tyrians demonstrated their weapons' effectiveness by slowly executing them with burning sand in full view of the Macedonian army. Alexander faced his darkest hour, his causeway complete but unusable, his men terrified of the walls, his siege stalled. Lesser commanders might have negotiated, but Alexander possessed that dangerous combination of genius and megalomania. He devised a three-pronged solution that would transform siege warfare forever. But the Tyrians had one final surprise. As May became June, they unveiled modified versions of their sand weapon. Mobile furnaces on wheeled platforms that could be repositioned quickly, buckets on counterweighted arms that could fling burning sand 30 feet beyond the walls, even hollow arrows filled with the diabolic mixture. The island fortress had become a factory of innovative death. History pivoted on what happened next. Alexander's fleet, now numbering over 200 ships from allied cities, implemented a total blockade. No supplies reached Tyre. Meanwhile, he constructed the ancient world's largest siege towers, 150 feet tall, 20 stories of wood and leather and bronze, designed specifically to counter the sand threat. These towers featured thick leather curtains, constant water sprays, and most importantly, they positioned attackers above the sand-pouring devices. The moment that transformed siege warfare forever came on July 29th. Alexander's coordinated assault began with naval attacks on both harbours, drawing defenders to multiple positions. Siege engines bombarded the walls continuously, forcing Tyrians to shelter. Then, under cover of this chaos, the modified siege towers advanced. The lead tower, commanded by Alexander himself, reached the walls. Macedonian engineers had installed a revolutionary feature, a drawbridge that could drop directly onto the battlements, allowing attackers to charge across before sand defenses could be positioned. Alexander, wearing specially designed armor with minimal joints, led the charge personally. No army had ever attempted this before, or since. As the drawbridge slammed down, Alexander and his elite hypaspis stormed across the narrow bridge, 20 stories above ground. Tyrian defenders, caught between naval attacks and wall assault, couldn't concentrate their sand weapons. Hand-to-hand combat erupted on the battlements. bronze against bronze, with death waiting far below. The fighting reached maximum intensity. Tyrians poured regular boiling oil when sand furnaces couldn't be positioned. Macedonians threw defenders from the walls. Alexander himself killed the Tyrian commander Azamilkos in single combat, his sword finding the gap beneath the man's helmet. With their leader dead and multiple breaches opening, organized resistance began crumbling. But Alexander had one more card to play. As his forces secured sections of wall, he revealed his masterstroke. Portable bridges carried by the siege towers could extend between different wall sections, allowing troops to bypass strongpoints. Within hours, Macedonians controlled entire stretches of Tyre's defences. The cost? Beyond calculation. Contemporary sources claim 2,000 Macedonians died in the final assault alone, with thousands more bearing horrible burn scars from the sand weapon, but Tyre's fate was sealed. As the sun reached its zenith, Macedonian soldiers poured into the city streets. 7 months after driving the first stake, Alexander had conquered the inconquerable. In that instant, 2,500 years of independence ended. But the price of victory would shock even Alexander's battle-hardened veterans. As the sun set, Tyre's 2,500-year independence died. The massacre began before the last defenders had fallen. 7,000 Tyrians died fighting in the streets, selling their lives dearly as Macedonian fury, stoked by months of frustration and the horror of the burning sand, exploded into violence. Soldiers who had shown mercy at previous sieges now killed without hesitation. The screams echoing through Tyre's narrow alleys weren't battle cries, but the sounds of systematic slaughter. What Alexander did next shocked even his own men. As Tyrian resistance crumbled, thousands of civilians fled to the Temple of Melkart, claiming sanctuary in the sacred precinct. In previous conquests, Alexander had respected such religious asylum. Not this time. He ordered the temple surrounded, though he stopped short of violating its sanctity. For now, the crucifixion order came at sunset. 2,000 men of military age, anyone who had or could have borne arms against him, were condemned to die on crosses along the beach. Macedonian soldiers, many still nursing burns from the sand attacks, carried out the sentence with grim efficiency. By dawn, the beach from Old Tyre to the causeway's beginning was lined with the dying and dead. The hammering of nails continued for hours, punctuated by screams that carried across the now placid waters. Think about this for a second. Alexander, educated by Aristotle, heir to Philip's relatively civilized warfare, had descended into barbarity that shocked the ancient world. The young king who had wept over his enemy Darius's betrayal now walked among 2,000 crosses without flinching, stepping over pools of blood as if touring a conquered marketplace. 30,000 souls entered slavery that day, families torn apart on the docks as merchants bid on human cargo, a mother reaching for her child as Syrian traders dragged him toward their ships. Old men who had spent lives building Tyre's prosperity now wore chains, destined for mines in Thrace. The slave markets from Egypt to Athens flooded with Tyrian captives, the price of human flesh dropping from oversupply. But then physics itself became the enemy of mercy. The Carthaginian envoys, present for the festival of Melkart when the siege began, had witnessed everything. These representatives of Tyre's greatest colony watched their mother city die, unable to help. Alexander, in a calculated show of diplomatic courtesy, granted them safe passage, but with a message. Tell Carthage what happens to those who defy Alexander. The temple refugees presented a final dilemma. 15,000 civilians huddled in Melkart's precinct, including women and children. Alexander's rage had cooled enough to recognize that massacring temple suppliants would turn even allies against him. He declared general amnesty for these survivors, though they too faced slavery. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Alexander had begun this siege requesting to worship at this very temple. Personal stories emerged from the carnage. The Tyrian commander Azamilkos hadn't died in the wall battle as initially believed. Captured while trying to organize final resistance, he was brought before Alexander, the man who had mocked Macedonian efforts from his ships, who had orchestrated the burning sand defense, now knelt before his conqueror. That's when genius became madness in its purest form. Alexander ordered Azamilkos tied to a chariot and dragged around the city walls, a deliberate echo of Achilles' treatment of Hector in the Iliad. But unlike the mythical hero who eventually returned his enemy's body for proper burial, Alexander left Azamilkos' mangled corpse for the birds. The man who had defended his city for 7 months was denied even the dignity of a grave. The young Tyrian defender Hamilcar, barely 16, had led the last stand at Melkart's temple. When Macedonian soldiers breached the sacred precinct's walls, He and 30 companions held the entrance for 6 hours, allowing thousands of civilians to claim sanctuary deeper within. Wounded 7 times, Hamilcar finally fell when a Macedonian spear pierced his throat. His sacrifice saved lives, but his name appears in no Macedonian account. Victors write history, and they preferred to forget such heroism among the conquered. But wait, it gets worse. The destruction statistics tell only part of the story. Beyond the 7,000 combat deaths and 2,000 crucifixions, disease and starvation claimed thousands more in the siege's aftermath. Tyre's sophisticated water collection system, damaged in the fighting, couldn't support the remaining population. Bodies in the streets bred plague. The harbour, choked with wreckage and corpses, turned toxic. Alexander ordered Tyre rebuilt as a Macedonian fortress, but the city that emerged bore no resemblance to its former glory. The causeway, now permanent, had altered ocean currents. Sand accumulated against the mole, gradually widening it. Within decades, the island had become a peninsula. Alexander had literally rewritten geography. The mole's permanent legacy extended beyond mere land. Tyre's unique position, its inviolability, had depended on water barriers. Connected to the mainland, it became just another coastal city, vulnerable to land-based armies. The purple dye industry, disrupted by war and the loss of skilled craftsmen to slavery, never fully recovered. Phoenician naval supremacy, already waning, received its death blow. Modern echoes haunt the ancient battlefield. Today's Tyre sits atop Alexander's causeway, now expanded to nearly half a mile wide. Fishermen spread nets where Macedonian soldiers once bled. Children play on beaches where 2,000 crosses stood. The Great Walls exist only in foundation stones, incorporated into later construction. Time healed the physical scars, but the moment when human ambition conquered nature's barriers, that moment echoes still. What you're about to witness is ancient innovation at its most brutal, but the battle's end birthed consequences Alexander never foresaw. Tyre's permanent connection to the mainland stands today as testament to one man's refusal to accept the impossible. Where once half a mile of open water protected the island fortress, now a bustling peninsula exists, built quite literally on the bones of Alexander's ambition. Modern Tyre spreads across the ancient causeway, its apartment buildings and shops resting atop Macedonian engineering. The siege revolutionized warfare in ways Alexander couldn't have foreseen. His massive mobile towers inspired generations of military engineers. The coordinated land-sea assault became the template for every major coastal siege afterward. But perhaps most significantly, Tyre proved that no position was truly impregnable, if you were willing to pay the price in blood, gold, and human ingenuity. That's when the Tyrians unveiled their secret weapon's true legacy. The burning sand defense, born from desperate innovation, influenced military thinking for centuries. Byzantine Greek fire, medieval boiling oil, even early modern heated shot, all traced their conceptual lineage to those Tyrian defenders who turned simple sand into an instrument of horror. Military manuals throughout the Middle Ages referenced Tyrian sand as shorthand for any heated defensive weapon. Alexander's reputation transformed irrevocably at Tyre. The young king, who had shown clemency at Granicus, who had treated Persian nobles with respect, revealed a capacity for brutality that shocked contemporaries. From Tyre onward, cities calculated differently when Alexander approached. Sometimes they surrendered immediately, remembering those 2,000 crosses. Other times they fought with desperate fury, knowing mercy was no longer guaranteed. Consider the implications of what happened here. A 23-year-old commander literally moved the sea, connected an island to shore through sheer will, and broke a 2,500-year record of inviolability. If Tyre could fall, what couldn't? This psychological impact rippled across the ancient world. Defensive strategies that had worked for millennia suddenly seemed obsolete. The engineering legacy proved double-edged. Yes, Alexander's causeway demonstrated human capability to reshape geography itself, but it also showed the environmental consequences of such ambition. The altered currents changed local ecosystems. Fishing patterns, unchanged since the Bronze Age, shifted overnight. The harbour that had sheltered Phoenician trade for millennia silted up within centuries. Modern Tyre, built entirely on Alexander's causeway, embodies this permanence. Aerial photography reveals the ancient mole's outline, now expanded through centuries of accumulated sand and construction. Where Macedonian soldiers once drove cedar stakes into resisting seas, Lebanese families picnic. Where burning sand poured from murdered walls, tourists photograph Mediterranean sunsets. But the philosophical reflection cuts deeper. Tyre represents the moment when impossible became merely difficult, when human ambition refused to accept natural boundaries. Every massive engineering project since, from Roman aqueducts to modern tunnel systems, carries DNA from that 7-month siege. Alexander proved that with enough determination, resources, and willingness to pay the human cost, even geography could be conquered. 30,000 men changed geography itself, but at what price? 7,000 dead in combat, 2,000 crucified, 30,000 enslaved. An ancient civilization ended. The causeway remains, testament to human achievement and human cruelty intertwined. In conquering the unconquerable, Alexander revealed both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of human brutality. The lesson remains as relevant today as it was 23 centuries ago. The same brilliance that solves impossible problems can unleash unimaginable suffering. Tyre fell not to superior morality or divine favor, but to the dangerous combination of genius, determination, and the willingness to pay any price for victory. The causeway stands eternal, a bridge built of innovation and bones, forever linking ambition to its consequences.